we are told that we are fighting Islamism. It's like fighting communism. It's such an awful, dreadful threat that there is not a real debate about should we do it or what does it mean, Islamism.
January 2013. In the dunes of the Sahel desert, a column of pickup trucks heads to the Malian capital of Bamako. The trucks are driven by some of the most dangerous jihadists of the region. They sense an opportunity amidst the civil war-torn Mali, but at the demand of the central government of Mali, France launches Operation Serval and annihilates the jihadist column. The spectacularly successful Serval operation then gave way to the Barkhane operation. Barkhane's long-term objective was to stabilize the Sahelian region, a region as large as Europe itself. But over the past years, and despite the bravery of the 5,000 French soldiers on the ground, the situation has been worsening. Just this past week, we witnessed the murder of some 160 people in Northern Burkina Faso by jihadists, while Mali was rocked by its second military coup in less than a year. With the US preparing to end its forever war in Afghanistan, it seems that Europe and France are embroiled in their own Sahelian forever war. Where do we go from here? To answer that question, we are very glad to have Ambassador of France Gérard Araud and Michael Shurkin. But before we go on, don't forget, if you want to be uncommonly decent and support the show, there's a ton of small things you can do. You can subscribe to the show, and I don't want to spoil anything, but we've got some fantastic episodes coming up. You can rate and review, because these always put a smile on our faces and really help the show grow. And most importantly, you can share the show with a friend, the old-fashioned way. Share it with someone you think would make a good match of uncommon decency. Now, on to the Sahel. Just a small introduction of both of you so that our followers get to understand you a bit better. Gérard Araud, you're former French diplomat and an Ambassador de France. You've served as ambassador to the United States from 2014 to 2019, as permanent representative to the UN from 2009 to 2014, and as ambassador to Israel from 2003 to 2006. You are now a senior advisor at the Albright Stonebridge Group and a senior distinguished fellow at our friends from the Atlantic Council. Michael Shurkin, you're an American expert on French and European security matters with a special focus on West Africa. You're the director of global programs for 14 North strategies. And you're a former senior political scientist at the RAND Corporation and a former political analyst for the CIA. Thank you so much to the both of you for being on the show for what I hope should be a fascinating conversation. There's been a lot going on in the Sahelian region over the past few weeks. Yesterday, there was a major attack in Burkina Faso with 160 people being shot by a jihadist group. There's been another coup in Mali the past few weeks. So before we discuss the current situation, let's go back to the genesis of all this, back in 2013. Why did France intervene in the first place? What were the strategic interests that drove President Hollande to make that decision? What was the circumstances on the ground? And maybe, Michael, you can begin with that and kind of set the landscape of what was going on in 2013.
Sure. So my understanding of what happened in 2013, first, unfortunately, it's always the case you have to back up even further than that. And the next place to back up to is 2012, where there was a Tuareg independence group called the MNLA, which rebelled and attacked the Malian state. And then what happened is that some Islamist groups, then including AQIM, then to use the American expression, dogpiled on top of the Malian state and sort of joined in the fun. And then what they did is they very quickly rolled the Malian state out of northern Mali, and then they turned on the MNLA and pushed that aside. So it ended up becoming a sort of a de facto emirate, although run by three separate groups that had agreed to get along. AQIM, something called referred to as Mujao, and then the Ansar Dine. And then what happened after that, or in the meantime, also there was a coup in, I think it was in the spring of 2012, where a Malian army captain launched a coup that toppled the elected president of Mali, which did absolutely nothing good. I must say that. Because then it just added even more kind of confusion and paralysis on the part of the Malian state and made it harder for the Malian state to do anything. Plus, it angered the United States, which then froze its security assistance, and the whole international community was sort of aghast. But then what happened is then there was a funny war, a drôle de guerre, that happened then between sort of northern Mali and the rest of Mali, with almost a line of demarcation. And during this period, what the French government was doing was trying to rally an international response, drawing on ECOWAS, on the African Union, and also at the United Nations, to try to put together an international Africa-based intervention force to intervene. And all the while, I believe the French government was saying very clearly that France itself would not intervene. But they wanted to act through these multilateral entities. And this was the status. This is the way things were going. Again, with this funny war, this drôle de guerre, up until one day in January, I think it's the 10th or 11th. I'm sorry, I don't remember the exact date. In which suddenly the Islamist groups launched an offensive, heading, apparently it looks kind of in the direction of Bamako. And within 24 hours, the French government Hollande reversed his decision, reversed the policy of non-interfering, and decided to interfere, and non-intervening, and decided to intervene, all within 24 hours. And then they actually intervened. So French special forces who were in the area because of something called Operation Sabre, were the ones who were, because they were on hand, those were the ones who were first thrown into the breach. And it is my understanding that the motive, Hollande's motive, was had to do with the fact that the Islamists apparently were making a run for Bamako. Bamako had a very, very large number, by the way, of French citizens, both expats and just, Malians, these people who had French citizenship and French passports. And so the number, I regret that I don't recall offhand the number, but the number of French citizens who were in danger, in jeopardy, if the Islamists were to reach Bamako, was so large that an evacuation would have been impossible. So, it's just a practice in this part of the world that if there's a crisis, that one does a military intervention simply to extract the citizens from the capital and airlift them out. And this has happened many times in West Africa over the past 20, 30 years. But the number was just too great. And so the reasoning is then, okay, you have to stop this. And initially what the French intervention's objective was simply to save Bamako by stopping the armed offensive and halting the column. And then very quickly, over the course of hours and days, the objectives evolved and went from simply stopping the offensive to pushing it back, and then ultimately to, quote unquote, liberating all of northern Mali. But that was not the immediate thinking, right? First, intervene to save, and then maybe set up some sort of division, like what I think France did in Chad under, I think, Operation Manta, where they sort of drew a line, like a red line, and then push back. And that's my understanding of the reasoning and how that all worked out.
Ambassador, you were at the UN at this moment. Can you walk us through that 24 hours that kind of shifted everything, and have any kind of insights you have from that period?
Thank you, Francois, and it's a pleasure to be with you and to be with Michael, who is one of the best specialists of French operations abroad and especially in Mali. If you allow me, really, before answering to your question, I think I think it's very important to have a debate about the French policy in the Sahel right now, because it's very striking to me that there is not such a debate in France, right? It's not such a debate in France. We have more than 5,000 soldiers deployed, doing a great job in the most difficult circumstances. I think we need to have a political debate. On my side, I think I want to insist I'm very much on the question mode. It happens that I've been working extensively recently on the Vietnam War, and again, I was struck by really, I don't say comparisons, but the fact that a lot of elements which were explaining, in a sense, the American policy, you could see that in the French policy towards the Sahel. For instance, we are told that we are fighting Islamism. It's like fighting communism. It's such an awful, dreadful threat that there is not a real debate about should we do it or what does it mean, Islamism. I think it's a question, and that I think Michael, who knows the situation on the ground, I think it's an important element. At the time they were saying that if Saigon falls, we'll be obliged to fight on the beaches of Hawaii. And a lot of people say, oh, if Mali falls, we'll be obliged to fight in our suburbs. Really, is it really the case? Really? And by saying that, we are also denying the agency of the local actors. So there is a lot of, frankly, and nobody is able to define what will be a military victory, for instance. So we need to have this conversation. As for your question now, I've been, in a sense, I've always been a bit provocative, but there is a big, for the French presidents, whoever are the presidents, there is a big temptation, which is basically push two buttons on his desk. One is the Security Council button. Really, when he doesn't know what to do, or ambassador at the UN is obliged to go to the Security Council. We are permanent member. So that's still, I should say, an instrument which makes us as a sort of great power. And the second one is the military instrument. And when you compare France, as you know, to most of the European countries, you have a much easier acceptance of using military force that certainly Germany, but even Britain. Really, when you look at the numbers of military operations in which the French have been involved in the last decades, it's really a striking element. And in parallel with the Sahel, we were very active, actually more than a lot of people believe. For instance, in Syria also. So that's also something which is particular, and that the French should be aware of it. So on the morning of January 2013, I was looking on the TV like everybody and seeing our soldiers really uh, coming to Mali, arriving in Mali, but I didn't know, frankly, we were not told and at my level, I was not told whether we would stop in Bamako, defending Bamako. And to be frank, on the UN side, because there were UN experts, I heard people were really saying, "Oh no, they were not heading towards Bamako." Really, so I don't know what was really the threat to Bamako. But as Michael said, it was very difficult to run a risk of having the guys arriving in Bamako, considering the number of our citizens. But very, very quickly, we saw our soldiers going north, and very quickly on my side, I was requested by my authorities, basically first to explain to the members of the Security Council our intervention, the legal basis of it, which was Article 51 of the UN Charter, the article about self-defense of the Malian government. So we had to get very quickly from the Malian government a request of intervention. I'm not sure that the request came before or after. And after that, we saw the deployment of our forces. And on my side, I had to go to get support by the UN. And after that, a few weeks later, the idea of a UN peacekeeping.
Anyways, thank you so much, Mr. Ambassador, for this explanation. Let's fast forward to today because Mr. Ambassador has already kind of moved us in this direction. It's 2021. Yeah, exactly. Went straight there. Fast forward to today. Has the situation improved that much since 2013? We were talking about the latest attack in Burkina Faso, but more generally, fatalities in Mali and the larger Sahel region have really surged over the past few years. There's also a major issue with food insecurity. The regional armies are incapable of taking over the French army. And if you want to focus on the Malian army, there's been some pretty serious accusations of extrajudicial killings. Mali has been rocked by 2 coups in the last year. And there's also a rising anti-French sentiment in Mali. Michael, walk us through the kind of general strategic situation in the region. Is this too bleak a portrayal, or is the French intervention, Operation Barkhane, and France's large involvement in the region at this point failure?
It's not too bleak. I mean, regrettably, there's no way around it. The situation is absolutely terrible, both from the security situation, from the sort of the portions of territory that are frankly under the control of the Islamist groups, to the disarray that you see in terms of the Malian political side, the Malian government with these coups. It's just a mess. It's really bad, and. But the question of whether or not Barkhane is a failure or not is really it's hard to say. I mean, to some extent, there's only so much that Barkhane can do. First of all, because it's actually very small, and it sounds like a lot, but it's small. It's really only currently it's 55,100 troops according to the Ministry of Defense website in an area that I know a lot of listeners, might not grasp this, but the size of the Sahel is vast, and the distance from Nouakchott to Chad's border with the Sudan is almost exactly the same distance as from San Francisco to Philadelphia, and it's gigantic. And even just Mali is absolutely gigantic. Northern Mali itself is about the size of France. So when you're dealing with 5,000 troops, with like a dozen air transport helicopters, it's like it's whack-a-mole. There's very little that one can accomplish. And part of what's happened is that there has been this evolution over the last few years where what started as if you go really back to the early 2000s, it starts with this Algerian terrorist group, the GSPC, that's using northern Mali as a safe haven in order to focus to support its fight against the Algerian state. And it didn't have anything to do with Mali, wasn't concerned with Malian fights. The Malians weren't really worried about them. But then what's happened over time is as GSPC evolved into AQIM and is now, everything's grown. You've gone from a sort of a small group with a particularly narrow agenda to what I'm trying to describe, more and more, although it's hard to be precise, an Islamist insurrection, where lots of groups, native groups, I mean, these are Malians now, we're no longer talking about foreigners, and Burkinabe and Nigerian have found it in their interest to take up arms for all sorts of various reasons. And in doing so, they are rallying to the flag of jihad, using jihadi ideology as sort of a way to understand the situation and also a way to make common cause with other factions who otherwise might not have anything to do with them. And it's been this mobilizing effect, the ideology, and it's also the case where, like, on one hand, the locals find in the ideology a way to mobilize. Right. At the other hand, the Islamist groups are also using local conflicts. They're instrumentalizing them in order to gain support. So there's almost a synergy, if you will, between sort of the jihadi group and its agenda, and then local people with their local agendas and local causes and local resentments. And they're very, very intermeshed to the extent that it's very hard to tell what's what. But because of the local nature of it, now what's happening is that it's become a lot more difficult to combat, because now, in order to fight these groups, it's no longer a question of sort of taking out identifying discrete networks and battling them. It's now about, frankly, counterinsurgency, which is, in the best case scenario, extremely difficult to do. And it's something that Barkhane itself is not sized sufficiently to actually do counterinsurgency, nor should it be. I'm not advocating this, but also there are also some things that make counterinsurgency extremely difficult to do in a post-colonial setting, right? I mean, it was already hard in Algeria where you're doing it in your own country, but it's not something that France can do and necessarily should do. So again, I'm not advocating it. I'm just trying to explain this in terms of how Barkhane's effect is going to be limited. It's very small. It's not actually fighting a counterinsurgency campaign, not really, but it's trying to confront what's actually an insurgency, or perhaps I should say insurgencies, because often different groups are fighting for different reasons. And ultimately, the best that Barkhane can do, given both its size but also, frankly, current French doctrine for this kind of fight, is buy the locals some space and some time to try to do all the things that they need to do in order to deal effectively with insurgencies. And what's worrisome is that when you look at the events in Bamako with these coups, these successive coups, one gets the impression that while the French might be buying the Malians time to get their house in order, the Malians themselves are not getting their house in order and seem to be distracted by other things. And that, I think, is that I consider to be more depressing and discouraging than casualty rates, right? Or attacks of violence, right? So if you ask me, is Barkhane failing? When I look at the battlefield, I say, well, not necessarily, because there's not much Barkhane can achieve other than buy space and time. But when I look at what happens in Bamako with these coups, I think, well, gosh, maybe it is, because it like fighting an insurgency in a post-colonial setting means that the intervening force, in this case the French, cannot do the hard political governance development work that the host nation has to do. All the intervening force can do, again, is sort of to buy some space and time, but I hate to use this analogy because it involves an animal, right? But it's like you can lead a horse to water, right? So you can create the space, but if the Malians themselves, they're going to have their own agenda and their own priorities, and they're doing their thing, but it doesn't look like at the moment they're particularly focused on doing what they need to do in order to defeat the insurgencies. And then that's a troubling question. Well, if that's the case, and I've seen, I saw the ambassador was, I think he tweeted something about this, like, well, why are we even bothering? And that's a really valid question. And that's where we get to what the ambassador said about how there really needs to be a debate. And I completely agree with that. And, in light also of the comparison with Vietnam, the debate has to be around what does it mean for the rest of us, the rest of the world, if we do nothing and let these Islamist insurgencies actually win. And I should also say that there are some, and I tend to disagree with them, but there's sort of some to the left of this debate amongst like Africa watchers, like academic Africa watchers, who would point out to me that Barkhane isn't simply buying space and time. Barkhane is making things worse, because by the French government, first of all, militarizing this, and then also providing cover for the Malians, Nigerians, Burkinabe, and Chadians, etc., to do their thing, but doing sort of bad things, then the French are just making it worse. And I tend to disagree with that, because I still tend to, it's hard to explain it, but I tend to disagree with this idea that yes, in some ways, Barkhane French policy is counterproductive, but I'm still not really sure what the choices are. And it's also, I don't really think that, I think there's a tendency for people to take away agency from the Africans themselves. And I think that the side that's critical of Barkhane is often sort of too interested in kind of giving these structural explanations for the failure of Sahelian politics, right? So because I've seen this on social media, like people will say, well, because of French policy, the result is authoritarian governments, right, and coups. And maybe French policy contributes to things, but at the same time, that to me takes away the agency of the Malians and the Nigerian and Chadian, etc., for their own political choices. But part of the debate that has to be, like, to bring this back to Vietnam, the ambassador is right. Once upon a time, the best and the brightest of the Washington policy establishment, to use, I think that's Habersam's phrase, the best of the brightest. People like at Rand or the think tanks and in the U.S. military and in the Pentagon were really convinced that if France fell to communism, Indochina, we can talk about France falling into communism, like I said, being the 1940s, like 47. If Indochina fell to communism, then the dominoes would fall in and be terrible. And at the end of the day, actually, when Vietnam fell to communism, while the results might have been deplorable for the Vietnamese, it didn't affect American interests any way, shape, or form. It didn't hurt France, and it was actually kind of fine. And in a way, I also feel like the world owes communist Vietnam a favor because they're the ones who destroyed Pol Pot, right? That has to be acknowledged. Like if it weren't for them, they put an end to that genocide. That's great. So were we all wrong? And that's part of the reason why I try to pull together as I was exiting RAND, a webinar trying to pull together. I pulled together a lot of experts to debate this, like what actually happens if, first of all, if Barkhane left, and would the area collapse, and would this be bad for everybody? And honestly, the results of that webinar were actually very inconclusive. And I think it has to do with trying to get one's head around what does it mean to be fighting Islamists, these particular Islamists. And what is going to happen to the whole region, and what's going to happen, whether or not there are going to be downstream effects for Europe and for the United States as a result. And it's really not clear. And I was struck by, in the webinar, but also in general, the diversity of views.
Are we reaching a point where the strategic advantages of France's involvement are really overwhelmed by the disadvantages? Or do you think a withdrawal would be a form of strategic impatience we would come to regret later on?
First, before reaching such dramatic decisions, I think it's time, and again, to do what Michael has done with his webinar. Really think about it. Um, it happens that on my side, by chance, two of my grand uncles were officers in the camel forces, the colonial camel forces in this part of the world. And I've heard a lot of stories about the fact that this gigantic area, to quote Michael, has never been controlled by anybody, has always been totally uncontrollable, and has always been an area of trafficking. In the Middle Age, it was gold, slaves, and salt, and now it's a lot of drugs coming from Latin America, actually, through Guinea-Bissau, but also weapons, cigarettes, and human beings. So what are we doing in military terms? In military terms, usually when you have a military operation, you have to define your achievable goals, and you have also to have an idea about how much time it will take, to reach this goal. And to be frank, right now, I don't think the French forces will be able to tell us what are their achievable goals. And meaning that there will be a moment when the French forces will be able to say, mission accomplished, and we can go home. If you look at what is happening, basically, we are, as Michael is saying, buying time, but buying time for whom? For the moment, as Michael has said, nobody is really using this time to reach a political solution, and killing terrorists. Really, we are back to what the Americans were doing in Vietnam, counting the number of casualties. But you can kill terrorists. There is always another one coming behind. So my conclusion is that if we don't change our policy, we are there forever. You can say forever is not that bad, because after all, it cost us 1 billion euros a year, and we have lost 60 casualties. We have had 60 casualties since 2013. 60 is of course too much. Every casualty is too much, but it's something which is politically sustainable. and let's do it forever. But actually, and going into what in direction really given by Michael, the problem that is the situation actually is not improving. You can say that the situation actually is worsening. We saw it recently in the Burkina Faso, the north of Burkina Faso, and it's not by chance because Burkina is obviously more and more actually threatened by terrorist activities. We had two military coup in Mali. We have the insecurity is widening. So and we there are also some basic points. You know that over time, any liberation army is becoming an occupation army. Our soldiers were greeted, with some enthusiasm in the north of Mali in 2013. I'm ready to bet that it's not anymore the case. And the simple fact of having also a foreign army, especially the foreign colonial power, is also a unifying element for all the groups of the region. And more we wait, more it will be the case, and more we should face radicalized opposition in the north. So let's say it very clearly: our strategy in the Sahel is in a dead end. So that's the moment of looking at it and saying, what can we do? Usually there are always the same recipes. The first one is called what is called Vietnamization. Really you say, oh, that's to the local soldiers to do the job. And we tried it. We tried it with the G5 Sahel. To be frank, it didn't work very well. So are we supposed to leave? But as Michael has said, there is a big question mark about what will happen if we leave. So, as I've said, it's. I think again, I think that the first thing is to have a real debate with specialists, with Africa watchers, especially. It's. I went with the Security Council to northern Mali. I think it should have been in 2014, in the spring of 2014, and I have met all the groups. The northern part of Mali. It's not only Tuareg. You have really a lot of different groups, obviously with different strategies. Maybe that 7 years later, maybe they are totally united, but I doubt it. Because their rivalries are rooted in history. It's basically the shepherds against the farmers, and African population against North African population, and there is the memory of slavery, of slave trafficking. There is the virulent hostility that I felt in Bamako against the Tuareg. There have been three uprising of Tuareg since 1960. The northern part of Mali has never been really controlled by the central Malian government. So, as I was referring in the beginning of our conversation about the agency of the local actors, maybe the African watchers will be able to tell us better. But and here it's very hypothetical what I say, but I wouldn't bet that the army of a former colonial power could be the solution of such and I think I'm not talking in terms of strategic impatience. I would think in terms of intellectual impatience. I think our foreign policy, and especially in this part of the world, has maybe been too militarized. Really, our soldiers are doing such a great job, but maybe we should go back to be more political, more diplomatic. Maybe our intelligence services, which are very active and very knowledgeable, and which don't always share the same analysis than our start discussing with this group. And last point, maybe that we should announce that we are going to leave. Maybe it would be also spur the local actors in a sense not to rest only on our presence, and really they will feel obliged actually to take initiatives if they know that we are not going to protect them forever.
Well, and unless Michael wants to follow up on this one, and Michael, please feel free if you do want to. But I wonder what both of you are hearing in terms of the way that the larger G5 Sahel region is being discussed in EU circles. That the region itself has been mostly seen as pardon my expression, but as really a sort of a policy protectorate for the French. That have really kind of taken up the mantle of handling all the anti-insurgency operations that you've listed. And I wonder what your sense is at this moment in time of what other EU member states and even the Brits what they're thinking in terms of whether it is the right time to pull out, and if this is getting any closer to being more of a European matter of interest.
Just before, I do want to respond to what the ambassador said. Before we get to the EU, because I think the EU is of course a very important topic. So I do want to get there, but I think that there is some impatience, some strategic impatience there's always with this kind of thing, because for reasons I've never fully understood, maybe just because of the cable network news service, and that there's always this expectation of very quick results. Like we want something like Serval, where there was this quick thing, and then Hollande could say mission accomplished, and in fact the mission was accomplished, and because Serval had achieved its aims, and this is what people want. But this kind of fight, particularly because we're dealing with ultimately with this very complex social conflict and insurgencies, these kinds of fights take a very, very long time, and I think that regardless of what's going on in the Sahel at the moment, I think it's always true that these conflicts take a very long time, and people need to be a lot more patient. And as part of that, when we look at things that have failed, and there have been a lot of failure, like, I think the G5 Sahel requires a lot of scrutiny and skepticism. I think EUTM, the training mission, has been largely a disaster. There have been a lot of mistakes for how things are done, how France and the international community have gone about trying to train the Malians and the Burkinabe, including Americans in this. So many things were done, but so many things were done really, really poorly, that I feel like it's very easy to make the case, well, okay, you tried and failed, but at the same time, if you only half try and do things that clearly aren't going to succeed, then I'm uncomfortable with then drawing the conclusion that, okay, well, this has been a failure and that we can't succeed and there's no way to turn this around. That none of these things can be improved. None of these approaches can be changed. And then a lot of this, and then we also get to the larger question, which again is the so what. I personally am convinced that if France were to pull out of the area militarily, that it would be a complete disaster. That even now, while things are looking very grim, I think that these things would get very bad. That these countries would all but collapse. I mean, there would be these rump states that would kind of exist and limp along, and there'll be somebody who's pronounced himself the president of Mali, whose authority will not go farther beyond, very far beyond the capital and maybe a few other cities, and that's the way it's going to be in all of these countries. And in the meantime, there's going to be a lot of violence. There's going to be a lot of anarchy. There's going to be a lot of terrible things, and huge population displacement. And that's also where I think that one needs to start thinking about, well, what does this mean for Europe? So again, Vietnam fell to communism. So what? Didn't really matter for people outside of Vietnam. Not really. This area really falling to what I'm pretty sure would be anarchy, that would still be worse than what it is today, because it can always get worse, and it will, then is there a so what? And I'm inclined to think that for Europe, at least, there really would be a profound so what because of the geographic proximity. So whereas Vietnam, which is on the other side of the planet, could, completely disappear or turn into I don't know what, it doesn't matter to us. I think that if the Sahel and West Africa, because I think this would drag down all of West Africa, I'm very certain that the ramifications, at least for Europe, would be profound, particularly given the sensitivity of European liberal politics towards the problem of migration, right? We've already seen how migration has fueled extremes and fueled the far right and played a factor in Brexit. And so that issue alone, I feel like there would be very strong negative ramifications for Europe. And I feel really convinced that the worse things get in the Sahel, the worse things will get in West Africa, and the greater the refugee problem. But I also, I think the ambassador and I completely agree that these, I am speculating, and that these are the things that people need to be debating, right? The so what? What if it all goes to hell? Because I'm pretty sure it will go to hell. And that if the Islamist groups were to take over, it's not like some sort of weird Kantian peace is going to involve where it's going to stabilize. You just have to remove the colonizer, right? Which I feel like some people on the left think that that's the case. Remove the former colonial power, let things go back to nature, and then you're going to have some sort of weird new dispensation that we can all get along with, and everything's going to be great. I'm not so sure.
Well, first, really, before going to the EU, really, I would not, really, and rebounding about what Michael has just said. Let's also let's not forget that there is also French domestic politics, and for the moment, nobody is really talking about our operation in Mali because it's against Islamism, quote unquote. So everybody agrees that we should do it. But again, as I have said, it's also because we have had a sustainable number of casualties. What will happen really if tomorrow or in a few days you have suddenly 25 French soldiers killed? What will happen in 6 months or 2 years? Democracies are not very good to waging forever wars. And so I think it's impossible to bet on the fact that we will be able to fight for the next 20 years. And that's, we are talking in these terms, really, since there is absolutely no prospect for the moment of any political settlement, no prospect of any military victory, we should think in these terms. And so that's the reason why I think that it's better to preempt what will happen sooner or later, and which will be simply people saying in Paris, it's over. We really we have tried and we failed, and so it's better to anticipate this situation rather than to have an ambassador leaving the roof of an embassy with his flag under his arm. As for Africa, let's be really, and I went through that for all my career. There is among our EU partner a very strong feeling that the French are waging after colonial wars in Africa. And as I have said, we have a natural inclination to use the military tool in a much easier way than all our European partners. On the top of that, the Europeans don't know very well French-speaking Africa, because frankly, it's not the most prosperous part of Africa. And they don't have an history of involvement of the Europeans, involvement, economic or political or human involvement in French-speaking Africa, and in particular in Sahel. When you are talking to the Europeans about the Sahel, their reaction is basically a reaction of economic aid. And they are right also. Don't forget that it's really the population of Mali is doubling every 18 years. It's the place in the world where you have the highest the demographic growth. There is also the desertification, which is linked to global warming. So their first reaction will be certainly to react in terms of aid. In military terms, there is maybe, if there are now European forces, um, and maybe I'm unfair, but I should say that my interpretation was, first, there was a lot of French pressure, French begging, and at the highest level. So at some moment, it was difficult not to do anything. Second part, it's a very good training ground for special forces. And so since the Europeans are leaving Afghanistan, it's and since the idea is that the coming conflicts could be this sort of conflicts, it's not bad to do it. You have also military elements which come, but which don't do a lot. And I wouldn't say which countries are not very military active, even if they have a contingent on the ground. In any case, and again, maybe I'm unfair, and maybe I am simply reflecting the prejudice of the French military. But obviously, the EU is doing, I should say, more or less the minimum it should have done. There is not a strong feeling in Europe that the fate of Europe or the security of Europe is really at stake there. As Michael has said, I think the only element which could change the calculations of the Europeans, and maybe are changing the calculation of some Europeans, really, I don't really about maybe the Spaniards or the Italians, is the question of migrations. Obviously, that's a question which is of a major concern, but I'm not sure that it's a very strong concern in Northern Europe. Last point, which has no relationship with whatsoever, I should say, with the EU. But the name of Algeria has not been still really, the word Algeria has not been still pronounced. And, you know, I think that the Americans are right, when I say the Americans are right to leave Afghanistan, immediately afterwards, usually I say, well, now it will be also the problem of the local powers. In a sense, Afghanistan is more a problem for China, for Russia, for Pakistan than it is to the US. So let's not forget also the local actors, not only the groups, but also the countries and Algeria, which has played a very ambiguous role all over the crisis and is still playing an ambiguous role. I think Algeria will be obliged also to step in, which means Morocco is not far away, is not also far away. So I think that's an element that we should also take into account.
Quick fire question before both of you go. If you had to guess, do you think we are seeing the last days or maybe months of France's Barkhane operation? We know President Macron has suspended France's bilateral military cooperation with Mali over the second coup. Could this be the first sign of the end of an operation? Michael Shurkin first.
I don't think so. I would be surprised, but maybe it comes down to the election and whether or not Macron feels that that's something that he needs to do in order to win the election. But it's not clear to me though that yeah, it depends. We can't presume. But I'm not aware that pulling out of the Sahel is a major election issue, at least thus far. So I think that assuming it doesn't become a major election issue, I don't see France leaving anytime soon.
I was just reading a poll before this. I think for the first time, a majority of French people are opposed to Barkhane, but again, I'm not sure how potent that is and will be in the election. Mr. Ambassador?
No, I think Michael is perfectly right. You are right. I think it's the opposite. I should say that it will be very difficult right now, considering the political atmospherics in France, actually to campaign on the idea of Barkhane leaving, which will be seen as a defeat, an abdication, and so on. I wouldn't exclude, really, nevertheless, that if he's reelected, after the election, if he's reelected, maybe he will have a look. He will have a look at the operation, at the prospects of the operation, and maybe he could be tempted to try something else.
I think that's possible, and I'm also hoping that because it's not a hot election campaign, and I think that Macron is capable of being very pragmatic, that they are taking a hard look, and thus, and he'll have a relatively free hand because there's no particular pressure. I mean, I would also I remind you that as far as I'm aware, Afghanistan never came up once in the 2020 presidential election. I mean, nobody cared. I mean, people might care more about Barkhane in France than Americans do about Afghanistan at this point, but there's no, I don't know. People are more concerned about fighting over far less important things, to be honest.
Thanks a lot, Michael, and thanks a lot, Mr. Ambassador, for your fascinating comments on the situation in the Sahel. Thank you so much. We had a good overview of what happened since 2013 and how seemingly the situation gets worse. I think you both made a case for either progressively leaving or keeping boots on the ground. Strategic impatience versus strategic patience. So I guess we'll see. It might be a hot button issue for the next presidential election. Unlikely, but who knows? Thanks to both of you and to all our listeners. Thank you so much for tuning in, and see you next time. So thank you so much to Ambassador Araud and to Michael Shurkin for this great conversation. Jorge, what did you make about this whole debate between strategic patience and strategic impatience?
Well, so I thought it was so coincidental that the same kind of strategic dilemma is playing out with the U.S. Afghanistan operation, which Joe Biden, just as this episode goes to press, is still touting the withdrawal of U.S. troops from Afghanistan, and the kind of the strategic questions that played into that decision. Although he's carrying over that policy from the Trump administration, but essentially the realization that the strategic advantage of having a U.S. presence on the ground in that country is just surpassed by the problems that go with that. And in the context of France and the Sahel, I heard a lot of echoes to the national security conversation that America has in Afghanistan. And so I thought it was really, really almost fortuitous. And I think the idea of speaking of Europe's endless wars also kind of it hews transatlantic. So it goes right at the core of what we're trying to do on this podcast, namely to unpack and explain the drivers of the policies that emanate from Europe and make them understandable to a U.S. audience. So I think it's almost, again, it's fortuitous that the issue is being debated in much the same way on both sides of the Atlantic, and I think our American audience is going to appreciate knowing that France is also strategically overextended in some respects in this particular region. What did you think?
I thought Ambassador Araud was right to say, okay, if we are going to have this conversation about staying, and there's a case to be made, but we have to think, 20 years term, because the situation currently is worsening, and before things get better, especially given what happened in Burkina Faso the other day, you're going to need patience, and patience is something which is not easy in a democratic regime. It's only €1 billion a year, which is not that expensive. Roughly 8 to 10 casualties a year, which is obviously horrible, but politically manageable to some extent. But 20 years is a long time. And the risk is in 20 years, we're still here. And a bit like Afghanistan. Afghanistan has said, well, we can't leave because the situation is going to get worse. We can't leave because the situation is going to get worse. We can't leave because the situation is going to get worse. 20 years later, we're still here, and we still have the same conversation about if we leave, the situation is going to get worse. And so now we all know the moment the Americans leave Afghanistan, things are going to get worse. There's no doubt about that. The Taliban's will come back. But the alternative is waiting another 20 years and leaving then, and the situation is still going to get worse. It's kind of It's a very tricky situation. I mean, I think one of the good points that was being made was another comparison between Afghanistan and the Sahel region is some local actors have been completely absent or very secondary. And if America and France, respectively, leave Afghanistan and Mali, then all of a sudden you have countries which have been kind of dozing off and free riding on the security effort of these countries, which will have to kind of wake up. In the case of Mali, that will be Algeria, which is very much embroiled in its domestic affairs, has been content playing the troublemaker. But when all of a sudden you have someone doing the policeman, maybe Mali's going to have to step up, and maybe maybe the Malian states, maybe Niger, maybe Burkina Faso, and the governments also have to step up. Speaking of, no, go ahead.
No, yeah, I thought the ambassador's mention of Algeria there was it's not something you hear often, and again, as you were telling me off the record, the question you got to ask yourself when it comes to making that call of whether or not you withdraw troops is who's going to fill that vacuum, right? And in the Afghanistan context, that would be local groups, but in the Sahel, it kind of raises the question of what are these weak states going to do, policing what happens inside their borders when, in fact, there's more actors involved in primarily countries like Algeria. And so I thought that mention was key.
Yeah, and to go back to the local states of Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, there's a kind of a tough situation for France because often people say the reason the jihadist groups are thriving is because to a large extent for the local population there isn't much of a difference between the jihadist groups and the local government. And if anything, the local government, and its kind of affiliated ethnic militias are as deadly as the jihadist groups. So it's hard to blame this kind of maybe not support, but at least acceptance of these jihadist groups when for them in reality it doesn't change much whether it is the government holding the Kalashnikov or whether it is the jihadists holding the Kalashnikov. And so often because of that, you get the UN, you get all these international organizations pressuring France to make sure they pressure these local governments on human rights and governance. And obviously, if the Malian government was better on human rights, and if it was a more democratic regime, things probably would get better. But it's not easy because you don't have that much leverage because the Malian elites know that France is going to stay here for a little while. So it's not an easy conversation. But even if France went all in on pressuring Mali and other regimes on human rights and whatnot, France's colonial history would come back, and there'll be a constant suspicion and barrage of attacks on neocolonialism and whatnot. So it's a very much a tough situation right here. And I'm not sure. It's a down if you do, down if you don't, pretty much. Yeah.
Right. So let me go off of just that and ask you if you could give our audience a sense of how the issue is playing out domestically in the political stage ahead of the race next year. Is Marine Le Pen kind of staking a different policy turn in this question? It seems like the National Rally is traditionally nationalistic in terms of foreign policy. There's obviously the lineage of a certain cast of mind in French foreign policy that couldn't really digest the Algerian disaster. But what's the issue being discussed like? I mean, what are some of the cleavages between the two candidates as they look at the region?
Yeah, it's it's not her winning issue. I think she realizes that. There's been a bit of a shift, I think, in the past few months. I mean, more generally, there's been a shift in France on this issue. Traditionally, Mali had pretty wide multi-partisan support for this because stopping jihadism after Bataclan. I read a really good article, I forgot where this American reporter interviewed some French soldiers, and they asked them why they were fighting Mali, and they just said Bataclan, one word. It's not obvious at this point that the intervention is actually doing much for the domestic security front in France, but I think that Marine Le Pen is going to be more opportunistic than driven on this issue, because if Macron retracts his troops, she's going to accuse him of being weak on Islamism, and if he stays there, she's going to make a case of how you're having boots on the ground defending people who don't want to be defended, and the Malian people don't even want to say, what are we doing? So Yeah, it's tough. I don't think it's going to be a major political issue because it's €1 billion a year. It's expensive. It's not that expensive. For 5,000 troops. I mean, the issue is it constrains France's strategic capabilities outside of the region because it has so much of its energy focused there. But I don't think it's going to be a major issue. And I think there was a window to leave. I think really like the past week, second coup, there really was a window to leave. But now with 160 people dying in Burkina Faso, I think that window is kind of rapidly closed. And those kind of events, those kind of windows don't present themselves that much. And I think Macron's probably thinking about it, but I'm not sure he'll get a second window of that size to exit the region.
Yeah. And it seems either way. Back to your earlier point that Marine Le Pen's general argument in terms of foreign policy is for a more radical pivot away from like the traditional transatlantic system of alliances towards a friendlier relationship with Russia. And it seems like her foreign policy pitch is at a higher level. And as you said, her whole pitch of having France kind of carve out its own diplomatic stance apart from the EU, it kind of goes and it doesn't really offer much. It doesn't really interact that much with the North African situation. If France is already having a pretty overextended role in the region, so I totally understand why she wouldn't want to.
But it's to some extent is also a self-inflicted issue. France has been a bit of a pyromaniac firefighter, if you want, of the region because let's not forget we helped the Libyan rebels topple Gaddafi, and we sent money and poured weapons into the region, and most of the weapons, well, not most, but a large chunk of these weapons are now being used by the very terrorist groups we are fighting the Sahel. So French leadership was a bit short-sighted back in 2011. It was before Hollande. It was back when Sarkozy was in office. But I think the West has been a bit guilty of strategic bit of strategic myopia on Libya, and we're kind of paying the consequences of it. I mean, I'm sure there's a case to be made that Libya or no Libya, the region was going to explode in the next few years, but I think Libya definitely did not help.
Yeah, absolutely. Well,
anyway,
just a very rich episode today.
Thank you so much for all of you. See you next week.